Good morning in Canberra, good evening from the United States. I honour the first Australians on whose lands we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. And I acknowledge in particular the stolen generations and all Aboriginal people who join us around our great nation Australia and indeed around the world today. I acknowledge also the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister Linda Burney, the Leader of the Opposition, members of the Cabinet, members of the Parliament gathered together in Canberra. I acknowledge also Ian Ham from the National Healing Foundation and his injunction to us all today. I acknowledge my colleagues from the National Apology Foundation and also Message Stick and the indomitable, indefatigable Michael McLeod, whose dedication to the hosting of this breakfast each year causes us, requires us, forces us to reflect again on the continued imperative of national reconciliation for Australia. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. I'd like very much to be. But even from here in Washington, DC, I sense a particular loss on this day and this anniversary of the apology. It's the first we celebrate in the absence of that truly great Australian, Dr. Lowitja O'Donoghue. Our nation has lost a remarkable woman, a beautiful human being, a leader for all Australians, black and white, and we mourn deeply her passing. She was central to the campaign for the apology over many years, even when it seemed Canberra had shut its ears and all hope was lost. These were the days when some still denied the very existence of the stolen generations, and that was despite the fact that there was irrefutable documentary evidence, records, that children were in fact stolen from their families. Lowitja understood the power of telling the simple, unvarnished truth about our history, because the simple truth is our history shapes our future. And if we don't have a shared understanding of our history, of what we have done right together and what we have done wrong, we cannot build a shared vision for the future. Lowitja understood that just as you can't build a strong house on a weak foundation, you can't build a strong nation on uncertain footings. Lowitja was the embodiment of sublime determination, personal grace, a woman of great distinction, and an abiding passion for social justice. In other words, she was the very best of all of us, the very best that is Australia. And that determination is one of the reasons we are all gathered here today. Just moments after I delivered the national apology 16 years ago, Lowitja and I embraced on the floor of the Parliament. I remember it as if it happened yesterday. I remember also the look of sheer delight, unrestrained delight on her face that day. She said to me, "Wonderfully done, Kevy, only 200 years too late." That's her way of handling things. A word of encouragement, a compliment, reinforced with a good solid whack. That was our Lowitja. And many of us, as you know, also knew full well that Lowitja herself had been stolen from her mother as a toddler and put into a mission. When she left that institutional home, the matron told her she wouldn't amount to anything. Well, those self-satisfied, judgmental, and downright cruel remarks only served to make Lowitja that much more determined. It's a sad thing that Lowitja did not live to see constitutional recognition. Aboriginal people today are hurting. They are hurting again. And we've heard something of that this morning. There are now fresh wounds, and these wounds are still very raw. And for this, I am saddened, and I am sorry for the further pain that has been caused our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. But I have no doubt that if today Lower Chur was still with us, she would be urging us to once again put our shoulder to the wheel, just as she had done over a lifetime, to keep working on the hard business of reconciliation, to keep working on the hard business of closing the gap, to keep working on the hard business that lies in the question of treaty. It's all too easy to become downcast in the face of adversity, but as Martin Luther King reminded us, the arc of history bends slowly toward justice. But it doesn't happen of its own accord. It happens because women and men of good mind, of good heart and goodwill choose to make it happen. They choose to make it bend. And everywhere around this country, our fellow Australians are working on the front lines today to do just that. One of the National Apology Foundation's projects in the past year has been a podcast called Listen, Learn, Respect. It's a series of interviews with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, doing that hard work, often in obscurity, a long way away from the nation's television cameras, to close the gap. I'm grateful to the Foundation's co-chair, my daughter Jess, for leading and hosting this project. It's about hanging a lantern on the things that work and the things that do not work in closing the gap. And whatever the area of endeavour, whichever closing the gap target we happen to be focused on, the message of local Aboriginal people has been the same. The difference so often between success and failure has been local self-determination. Trusting Indigenous communities and organisations to make decisions on the ground that they believe will work for them. You see, there are no silver bullets in this business. There are very few universal policy formula across our vast nation that will work and across so many Indigenous groups that make up Indigenous Australia. It's what works locally under local Aboriginal leadership that matters. Autonomy and local decision making is the essential ingredient. For example, you can see it at work in healthcare. When a patient is treated by a local community-controlled health organisation, peer-reviewed evidence shows that community-controlled services achieve far better outcomes for far less money. For services delivered by community-controlled health organisations, these are 50% more effective in health terms alone than those performed by mainstream clinics. And they're also 23% better at attracting and retaining clients. And there are flow-on impacts for Indigenous employment, for Indigenous education and for social mobility. And therefore the government's decision to more than double its pre-election commitment to build and refurbish critical health infrastructure at no less than 17 community-controlled organisations across Aboriginal Australia is a great step in the right direction. Remember, my friends, the apology had two parts. First, an acknowledgement of and acceptance of our troubled history. I take great solace from the knowledge that my grandkids have a far better appreciation of Australia's Indigenous past than my own kids had at their age. And that is miles ahead of what I learned at primary school in country Queensland way back in the Mesolithic period. That's when I was at school, where frankly these things were never discussed at all. And also now the Australian states will undertake their own truth-telling and agreement-making processes. And so we're about to learn a lot about massacres we've never heard of the killing spread of infectious diseases brought by Europeans, and of the forced removal of Indigenous peoples from their ancestral homes to parts of the country with which they had no connection at all. This truth-telling is the foundation to the second part of the apology, which is closing the gap. Because an apology is only made up of meaningless words unless it's accompanied by action in the real world. And that work is now being done by the nation's governments, corporations and philanthropists to enable and empower local Aboriginal communities on the ground to get on with the hard business of closing the gap in reality. The Australian voting public have decided not to empower local voices with a national voice to advise the National Parliament. That adds to the need for political leaders gathered in Parliament House today to find those voices and to listen to them. And we've heard one of them this morning in Ian Ham's comments as he addressed the gathering earlier. I would urge everyone on all sides of the political divide to do just that, to find your local Aboriginal voices, to listen carefully and to respond. Because as Lowitja O'Donoghue showed us by her remarkable life, we can never give up. Perseverance was Lowitja's signature strength. Let it be our strength as well. When one of us falls, it's up to the rest of us to pick up the ball and keep running, and running and running and running until this race is won. Only then will the arc of history still bend towards justice in our land, Australia. I thank you.